This is the multiple award-winning GardenDC Podcast, the podcast about everything gardening in the Washington, D.C. and Mid-Atlantic region. I'm your host, Kathy Jentz. I'm the editor of Washington Gardener magazine. Our content is aimed at gardening enthusiasts, people who grow everything from edibles to ornamentals, natives to exotics. If it grows in our area, that's what we talk about. Welcome to episode 226 of the GardenDC Podcast. In this episode, we talk with Kelly D. Norris, award-winning author and plantsman, on designing a natural garden. The plant profile is on Mangave, and we share what's going on in the garden, as well as some upcoming local gardening events in the What's New segment. We close out with the last word on the best seed starting methods from Christy Page of Green Prints. This episode, we're joined by Kelly D. Norris. He is a planting designer and author of several books. Welcome, Kelly.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
Great to have you, Kelly, and I get to have the excuse of picking your brain for the next hour or so I'm super delighted about that. But before we dive into all things natural gardening, let's talk about little Kelly. Were you born with chlorophyll in your veins and a green thumb?
I think you could say that. I grew up, gardening with my maternal grandmother particularly, but I grew up in an agricultural and horticultural place. So my family was very, connected and close to the land and in the many ways you could define that. And so, I've been gardening since a very young age.
And so from that influence, especially your family influence, did you envision yourself having a horticultural profession, or did you think you were going to aspire to something else, say veterinarian?
No, I was keenly a plant geek from a young age, and by the fifth grade, I told my fifth grade teacher that I was going to Iowa State to major in horticulture. She happened to be an Iowa State alum, hence the message. But I was very focused on wanting to pursue horticulture and as a career because I was just fascinated by the lives of plants. I mean, I enjoy being outside and all that other stuff that a kid could say, but I was fascinated by plants, and I was fascinated by plants, as I would come to realize in retrospect, in both gardens, like my grandmother's, and by plants in wild places, like along the roadsides between, the neighbors and out in the country where I grew up off the farm, and little remnant prairies in pioneer cemeteries, or the prairie remnant that was a quarter mile up the road from my grandmother's farm. I came to realize later, of course, that this was just a fascination with how plants live their life, sort of regardless of where that is. But I was equally. I had a foot in one, in each camp. I was as interested in plants and gardens as I was plants in seemingly wild places.
And since most of the audience for our podcast is in the Mid-Atlantic United States, let's talk a little bit about your growing region, what it's like, some of the conditions, your soils, and what you like to grow.
So I live in Des Moines, Iowa today, which is Zone 5B nowadays. But where I grew up was about 2 hours southwest of here. As I like to say, 2 hours from anywhere. If you drew a triangle between Omaha, Kansas City, and Des Moines, and put a pin right in the middle of that triangle, that's about where I grew up. And and I'm we're talking on a cold winter day, and that is pretty characteristic of what winters in the Midwest are like. Even though we're still officially Zone 5B, it's not uncommon for winter temperatures to sink into the negative 15, negative 20 degree range. Our soils here, though, are rich and deep, a connection to our prairie heritage and our natural history. One of the reasons why the prairie's gone, largely speaking, is because it was realized for agricultural value. Unfortunately, unfortunately or unfortunately, it's we have a tortured relationship with the prairie in some ways, and so deep, rich soils in a lot of places. But that's not a universal axiom. I mean, there's a mosaic to the landscape here at Three Oaks, our garden in Des Moines. we have extremely heavy clay soil, sort of on a hill that was defined by glacial activities and, disturbed by the slow evolution and creep of the city. And so, it's actually nothing like the soil I grew up with on the farm, just a few hours from here. It seems some days quite a challenge, but it's in that challenge that we begin to embrace the making of a garden with this place. It's a partnership with place. And so, the garden I started making here in 2017 when I bought the property, by parlance of the book, is a natural garden, but is is a little more than a half an acre and features kind of an unfolding mosaic of different garden ideas and habitats. And on that, 6/10 of an acre, we have easily 1,500 different kinds of plants growing today. And that rich diversity, although not in totally native to our state or even our region, but probably 85% of it is one way in which we can begin to study and understand and participate in the ecology of our place. So we grow a lot of things here at 3F.
And so that sounds like mainly ornamental, mainly native. Are you doing any edibles?
We don't do a lot of edible gardening here, only because, again, our underlying sort of soil condition would mean that there would just have to be a lot of fuss and a lot of effort. Our neighbors have quite the raised bed set up because it's it's just makes for easier sort of work. And we're blessed in this community by one of the best farmers markets in the country. It's a huge affair every Saturday during the growing season, and it's just easier for us to just go and support the folks who are not only good at it but making a living from doing it. We grow a lot of herbs in pots and things that we can keep in containers, but we also have an extensive amount of deer pressure because the garden is very close to the Des Moines River. We're only a quarter mile from the river's floodplain. And so, we're very blessed by that connection in ecological terms, but we have to embrace all that comes with, which is a herd of deer on a pretty daily basis.
Yeah, we should definitely talk some more about deer in a minute. But first, I want to introduce your new book's title, and that is Your Natural Garden, A Practical Guide to Caring for an Ecologically Vibrant Home Garden. Can you define what a natural garden is, Kelly?
That's a good question. There's a whole essay dedicated to it in the book. But, when we were working on the proposal and kind of working through the early stages of the manuscript, we tossed around different words, as anyone out there listening might. Natural, wild, naturalistic. What do these words mean, and what are we trying to say about that? And we ultimately landed on natural garden for a couple of reasons. And my previous book was called New Naturalism, which is not a term that's unique to me. It's a phrase that describes a lot of things right now happening in contemporary horticulture and the interface of horticulture and ecology. It describes more than a style. It's a strategy. It's an approach to how we design and steward landscapes and how we relate to the landscapes we live in and call home. And so, a natural garden is a garden that considers its connection to the story and the context of its place. All of our gardens, regardless of whether we have that awareness or not, or adopt that awareness, are connected to something. Nothing abides the garden gate or the fence, right? I mean, we can't sort of excise our little parcel out from the rest of the world. There's a connectivity to our little patch and our neighbor's garden and the park or the botanic garden down the street or the green space or what have you. All these things are stitched together, in one big ecological quilt. And so, when you start to use words and think about the way in which you come to define and relate to that little patch as part of that bigger quilt, it changes the way you think about gardening and the way you go about your day as a gardener. And it also changes, I think, the way you start to plan and plant for the kinds of interventions you may make in your landscape. And so it's a way of just sort of opening your mind and being a little more open to the inclusiveness of a great amount of diversity that we share the planet with.
Mm-hmm. And I love one of the sections in your book says, a gardener is a keystone species. And I'm like, yeah, I'm a keystone species. So, because, up till now, and in many people's philosophy, humans are the invaders, the encroachers, the spoilers of the landscape.
Yeah.
So I love this kind of twist on that.
Well, it isn't, again, necessarily a new idea. There's this discourse exists in the ecological literature about, of course, what keystone species are. That's an ecology 101 kind of lecture in college, right? But the idea of thinking about the landscapes of the world as they exist today, again, for better or for worse, as having largely a reflection of human activities. And so, we don't need to get into the philosophy of that in our time today, but at the scale of the garden, if you're a gardener out there thinking about, okay, how do I engage more generously, more broadly, however you want to frame it, with the world around you, again, as you adopt kind of a way of thinking about this, a kind of mental framework, a garden is really held in orbit by some effort of the gardener. I mean, I go to some links in the book to say actually that, the mark of making a garden is really an act of planting. Beyond that, we're just rambunctious mammals. But when we plant something, we're doing something that's very unique to our species. There are very few other creatures on the planet that plant in the same way that humans do. Most creatures that we could say plant something, like a squirrel, are provisioning. They are engaged in that activity as a means of sustenance, as a very basic component of their biology. When you and I dig a hole, we are manifesting a small unit of environmental disturbance, change at a minimum. It's not an environmental act. It's an act of our species that is manipulating some condition of the world around us. And so, that's the point at which a garden starts to be made. Because, you could prune a tree, you could pull some weeds, but at the end of the day, there are other mammal species doing that kind of stuff too. Planting, and the way that you and I do it, is what sets us apart from other creatures. And so that kind of keystone act, and then all the things that follow planting, right? Weeding and watering, pruning and trellising and tending, and just, all the fussing that comes in a horticultural capacity, starts to sort of look like, we're kind of making a little world here that, absent us, wouldn't really be the same kind of a world. So it isn't meant to necessarily put you at the top of the food chain exactly, as much as it is to say that the implications of your actions have ripple effects on a great number of other creatures around you. And that's in a way how we can take that notion of a keystone species in ecology, like the megafauna that aren't really extant on the planet anymore, or once were. We can take that proxy and say, well, how does this one organism, in this case, you, the gardener, sort of hold all these things in orbit around?
So true. And I think a lot of what we consider gardening is actually editing after the planting.
Sure, absolutely. I mean, there's, I think one of the great things about tendering just a little trust and faith in the lives of plants means that the order of magnitude of gardening, so to speak, that we're doing changes quite dramatically. It's so much of gardening in the last 250 years, Kathy, is based on this idea of trying to control something for out of fear or out of aesthetic. There's just all these things that we feel that we need to control. And it's so amazing to me to see people change as a reflection of how they relate to their landscape. I mean, I see this in our clients, residential clients particularly, where, we go on this journey with them. And I'm thinking of one in particular who's become a really good friend who, she had a very successful career and was at the top of her game in a lot of ways, and kept her life in order because she could keep things in control. She was the captain of the ship. And when those things aren't there anymore, when you retire or something, the garden becomes the object, right? You got to fuss everything, you got to prune everything, you got to hedge everything, and when you start to sort of change the whole scope of the garden to something more plant driven, those things fall away too. And it actually in the process can be remarkably liberating because in fact, plants aren't always just running away with the leash, right? And we're just giving them space to live their life. And so that modulation, that downward modulation of just relinquishing a little control can be cathartic.
Mm-hmm. And what is more controlling than maintaining a turf grass lawn, right? So I love
Right.
that. Yeah, I love that in the book you're advocating for less lawn or minimizing it or reducing it entirely.
Well, right. It's not the lawn's fault, right? I mean, it's not the turf grasses issue, right? I mean, these are plants that are sort of by sheer luck happen to be biologically adapted to frequent grazing. In our case, we're just substituting a cow with a lawnmower. I mean, we're doing it mechanically, and so it's kind of just sort of lucky that the dozen or so species, at least in North America, that form the majority of turf across 10 or 11 hardiness zones, just happen to be plants that kind of level of activity, disturbance, from mowing happens to just fit really well with their life. And so we've just taken a kind of, condition of nature, a meadow ecosystem, and just taken it to an ultimate extreme. And so it's not the plant's fault. It's our relationship with turf. I mean, it's not bad to have, tightly shorn areas of maybe a more monocultural relief in our ecosystems. That happens in the wild and natural places all the time. That shift in tempo from canopy to openness to the transitions in between. It's just that the way we go about doing it and the relationship we have with it is just extreme. And most people, even in a suburban condition, just have way more lawn than they even practically use. And so at that point, it doesn't deliver anything. It doesn't produce anything. It doesn't yield anything. It's just a sink for resources that you're just throwing resources into, and it's green as a result or something. It's strange, and it's a cultural phenomenon that is very unique in today's terms, 2025. It's a cultural phenomenon that's pretty unique to North America. It's not nearly held in such fascination in most other places.
Yeah, and it's such a resource heavy thing to maintain, and of course your own time, your own obsession, as you will, just to keep it looking decent for the neighbors is really why I think a lot of people are doing it. It's not that they love mowing the lawn so much, but it's because others expect that's how you maintain your landscape. So when you're transitioning your landscape to, say, a natural garden, there has to be some kind of indication that it's being cared for, that this is a transition. What are those signs that a gardener can do?
You strike at an interesting topic there, because, and I was just writing about it for this week for my newsletter that's going on to here soon. And this topic of aesthetics and cues for care, as the landscape architect Joan Nassauer called it many years ago in an essay that she wrote called Messy Ecosystems, Orderly Frames, that people may have heard about. This strikes at an interesting realm of things, because what we're talking about here, what you said by introduction of the turf and the signaling to people that, hey, I'm a good person, I'm mowing my lawn, I'm taking care of things, is an interesting dynamic in our culture, right? I mean, there's this need at some point for aesthetics to be the cosmetic face of our efforts. It's the sales pitch, right? It's the hey, this is intentional. Things are going the right way. See, it's pretty. Don't you like it? So that's and I'm not here to critique that, because that's clearly a cultural phenomenon. Like, that exists when we have research to support. I mean, there's actually a body of landscape aesthetics research that sort of illuminates that's a common condition in different parts of the world, different geographies. People have these different sensitivities, and not to say that there is a universal aesthetic language out there, but there are clearly things that signal to you or I or our neighbors or one or the other what's going on. And so, in a front yard garden, which we have a meadow in our front yard, which is, some people have called a kind of, a brave or kind of brazen act at the same time. And yet, one of the things that we've noticed over the course of 8, 9 years now with that in our front yard. We have met more people in our neighborhood by virtue of that garden. Now, one of the reasons is because we're in that garden. We're out there. We're cut. There's a turf path that runs through it, so we're cutting the path, every couple of weeks with a lawnmower. We're weeding the edges along the curb where weeds are, species we don't want are most likely to kind of take a foothold. And so, we were present, we're engaged, and we're visible. It's not just like, oh, they did that and we never saw them again. So I think there's one aspect. It's almost a little like theater there. Not to say that we're all out pantomiming in our gardens, but that there is an element of being seen and being engaged in something that kind of cues to other people. Oh, well, they're spending time out there. They're not just disregarding it. So I think that's important. The other thing that's important too, I think you'll see a lot. We refer to it in the book again in this mentality of cues to care, having paths and having even little structures, a fence, things that help to frame the scene, because so much of what we're talking about is born from a kind of need to see something scenic and something picturesque. That framework, whether it's a path or a fence or maybe a piece of art or what have you, can really say a lot to the world around us. It can say, there's a mark of human intention as a result of that. And so, it can be different in different places. Sometimes it's, in public spaces where we arguably do the most of our work, in public and commercial landscapes. There's research that shows that color is a major and important signal for people, yellow especially, and at certain percentages of the square footage available to us. One study shows that the point at which people's attitudes change is 27%. When they can see 27% of the surface in flower, particularly if it's one thing and it's one color, or one color. It says something. It says, oh, wow, that's really beautiful. There's like a wow factor there, that the research that came out of University of Sheffield some years ago. So, those kinds of little tools become things we just keep in our tool bag, right? It's like, well, okay, we have a big public space. We maybe we don't have all the resources in the world to plant it just like the perfect little garden, but what are gestures we can do to make this say, wow, to people around us? And so deploying color in a certain way might be one of those things. So we there's more about that in the book, but those are just some things that I think, a gardener out there can go, yeah, right. That's sort of the obvious low hanging fruit.
I love that 27% precisely. I can see somebody out there with a little calculator and counting each little black-eyed Susan head. And whoop, that one just went out of bloom.
It was a beautiful study. It was a series of surveys where they had set up different kinds of plantings that the same group of people over a whole growing season, actually over several years, because they did several repetitions, as I recall. People were surveyed about how they felt when they looked at it. Like, do you like it? Is it pretty? How do you feel? Like they got all this data, and it was really insightful, to hear and kind of see what people respond to. There's a lot of interesting studies out there like that probably don't get as much attention as they should, because they get at something very practical, right? I mean that landscape designers and planting designers like us, are kind of thinking about all the time. I mean, we're artists here working with and collaborating with plants, but we're always wondering, do people get it? I mean, is it coming through? Is the signal loud enough?
Yeah, and in my book, Ground Cover Revolution, I talk about literally putting a sign, this is a lawn in transition, or the signs that you could purchase from, National Wildlife Federation that says this is a wild landscape, supporting such and such. So that, you can be as literal as that, but I love the more subtle cues that tell people, this is a living landscape. It's being maintained. It's not just being turned over totally to the wild.
Well, and I love as a former public horticulture professional, I mean, the notion of interpretation. I mean, what you're talking about with signage is so important. I mean, it's, the history of interpretation in cultural environments really grew out of the National Park Service, the National Forest Service, and their work to try and help people understand suddenly this new resource that was being held in the public trust, and to be able to engage with it, interact with it. So that the history of how cultural interpretation kind of came to be what we know it as today is fascinating in that way, because it's this idea of almost narrating a scene or a view that people have in some way, and it can be remarkably effective when it's done well.
And I think almost today, social media is taking a lot of that on too, that interpretation and education and showing people. So a lot more people are exposed to those type of landscapes.
Sure. Yeah, I think that's certainly true.
GardenDC will be back after this short break.
Get low-maintenance alternatives to lawns with Ground Cover Revolution by Kathy Jentz. Reducing the lawn is among the biggest trends in homeownership, with an endless stream of homeowners looking for an eco-friendly alternative to a traditional turfgrass lawn. In the last few years alone, over 23 million Americans converted part of the lawn to a natural landscape, and now they're looking to do even more. The biggest challenge to adopting this new ideal of the perfect lawn? Knowing how and when to replace your turf, and which plants are the best ones for the job. Ground Cover Revolution is here with all the answers you need, and some you didn't even know you needed. Included are 40 in-depth profiles of plants that are perfect choices for replacing a grass lawn. There are options for sun, for shade, for dry and wet sites, and for various climates around the globe. There are choices that bloom, options that are evergreen, and selections that are deer-resistant. Kathy Jentz has also included an incredibly useful chart that gives you all the specifics on each of the 40 choices for quick reference and to make your ground cover selection process even easier. Whether you want to replace the entire lawn or just reduce the amount of land dedicated to turf, Ground Cover Revolution will help you usher in a new and improved idea of what a beautiful lawn should be. Ground Cover Revolution is available now wherever you buy books, including Amazon.com and Bookshop.org.
This episode is brought to you by Companion. Iris and Josh seem like the perfect match, but when a weekend getaway turns into a nightmare, Iris realizes that things aren't as perfect as they appear. From the creators of Barbarian and the studio that brought you The Notebook comes a twisted tale of modern romance and the sweet satisfaction of revenge. Companion, now playing only in theaters. Rated R, under 17, not admitted without parent.
Let's talk about some of those wild places that you loved as a child and how they translated. At the Philadelphia Flower Show last year, you had an award-winning display garden, and it was different than a lot of the display gardens that are normally seen at the flower show.
The exhibit was called A Beautiful Disturbance, and, at first blush is pretty far removed from any of the landscapes I encountered as a precedent, as a kid that have largely come to inform my work. So, the funny thing about that is that I'm a farm boy, a boy of the prairie that, grew up, went to college, and has been a city dweller now for his adult life, and has become totally immersed and fascinated in urban ecology, which is, when I was in graduate school, was kind of this confounding other world, right? It wasn't. And I still think there's a lot of ecologists that look at urban environments and think, it's like the modern hellscape, right? And actually, the data says quite the opposite. In fact, there's an emerging consensus that our cities are becoming these strange refugia for a great number of species, in part because, at least out here in the Midwest, the majority of the land is used for agricultural purposes. It's heavily disturbed and disturbed in a very uniform or relatively uniform fashion compared to, say, a city that has, this sort of crunchy typology of all different kinds of little micro habitats and spaces. And it's disturbed too, but it's more spatially complex. And so there's an emerging awareness that there's a lot of good ecologically that our cities are doing, from everything from feral abandoned lots, which we're going to come back to green spaces and traditional parks. The sum of all of that adds up to be quite an array of resources for a great number of creatures. Now, not everything, right? I mean, it doesn't replace the need for trying to conserve with, some sincerity the patches and parcels of relatively undisturbed land that still exist, as few and far between as those may be. But it goes to show that there's kind of a real life ecology, obviously, happening around us that we need to be sensitive to and aware of. And as a gardener, in an urban or a suburban environment, the nature that you experience at home is that nature of cities as they are today. And so our whole perception in the urban and suburban realm of what nature is this little reflection of this strange kind of novel ecosystem of, in some ways, of that a city is. And so, this idea about how do you start to create some attention around this? How do you start to draw people's attention to the places that are the habitats even that are hiding in plain sight? And so I've been fascinated just over the years traveling and just even in some cases in our neighborhood here on the north side of Des Moines, these sort of seemingly feral scraps, right? A little section of something left from development, or an area where a house got torn down, or maybe it was abandoned, or whatever, however it came to be. These strange little vessels have become catchments for an incredible array of species, not necessarily the most diverse collection of things in the world. They're not arcs, but they're, they still hold life, and they actually start to look like examples and proxies of things out there in the world, like glades in mountainous parts of the world, or the Ozarks in southern Missouri. These places where rock is really close to the surface. There's not a lot of organic matter, and you find plants just toughing it out. They're just stress tolerant species that have made do in this extreme environment.
There's a study around the port of Baltimore of native bees and how they have really moved back in because of all those little plants that have come up in the cracks, seeds dropped out of things that have been imported, things that have blown in, and they're like, this is our ideal environment. We like it better here than anywhere else because of that. But as you said, very thin soil over that surface.
Yeah, a lot of ground nesting bees need that open surface ground, whether it's of a mineral, gritty, sandy texture, whether it's truly something loamier that a gardener would think of as soil. That exposed open ground is so critical for so many ground nesting bees and their kind of just attempts to rear their young.
And one of my favorite things is taking pictures of what I call sidewalk crack plants.
Yes, right.
And when you're crossing a road, all of a sudden there's a little tree coming up in a little divot in the highway. Yeah. So I have to stop, run over, take that picture, run back.
Yeah, so it was those kinds of little postcard moments that started to kind of accumulate into a force that produced that exhibit that we started talking about here a few minutes ago about at the Philadelphia Flower Show. And so, which is to say that is just one example. Obviously, it's a flower show, so it lasted for 10 days and it was done. But it was one way of showing people that there isn't a method, there is a mode for engaging with those places. And maybe it's gardening with a lowercase g, and it's not, by any means the most intensive, but really shouldn't be, of activities. But it does show that these places deserve to be lifted up and to be seen. And I just think that whole kind of mode of action, could be playing out in communities all across the country and the globe, and in cities where that ecology exists. And so, we hope that doesn't stop at the flower show. We're always looking for kind of the next place to do something like that. We're in the midst of some conversations about some opportunities here locally in Des Moines for how to, essentially create a real life living version of that exhibit that might, be around for a couple of years. That might be something, isn't even really formally framed as an action, and that it's a place that people have to kind of just discover and kind of wonder what's going on here. So
that would be so cool.
I plant that seed out in the world. If anybody, we're interested in wanting to do that, wherever it takes us. We've had, it's a curious brief though, and it challenges people in a lot of ways. We think that developers would be very interested in, activating property. Sometimes it can take years to, finally get a building built or the permits or all this stuff. And in the meantime, there's little blue stem growing in the cracks of the sidewalks. There's all kinds of things popping up in the openings in the chain link fence. And so, we just keep putting that idea out into the world that, there is a way in which to celebrate and illuminate the ecology that's happening in very real time around us in our city.
I love that idea, Kelly, especially because you're talking about basically an ephemeral, in the meantime, space filling garden that is going to transition out, because so many times a developer might say, hey, community garden, you can move into this space while we're waiting to put the building in. But then when they say, now we're going to put the building in, the community garden is like, oh, no, you're not. So there's now that makes the next developer more reluctant to give that land over temporarily. So I think as long as there's the understandings in the beginning that this is temporary, it's going to be a transition space for learning, it's going to be so cool, but then it's going to be something else in 10 years.
Yeah. And that ephemerality is something I think we just, we struggle with. We want to build monuments to everything, right? We even gardeners at home have this, I carry, I think, a little sort of long-term guilt, right? I mean, they think that every action they have has this sort of permanence, and some actions have longer tail consequences than others, absolutely. But ecology, in the complexity of the world that we live in today, when you start to consider just how vast of a network of possibilities that is, I hope that's a gentle encouragement that it's not everything is forever, and frankly, not everything should be.
Agree. So let's go back to that dreaded topic of deer.
No.
And visit that for a few minutes. So you said your landscape is mainly native, but you're not prescribing 100% native for the natural garden. But when you're having a heavy native plant mix, you're obviously going to be attracting a lot of wildlife, both the ones you welcome and the ones you're like, maybe not you. So where do we find that balance?
Well, in one of the opening sections of New Naturalism a few years ago, when that book came out, I wrote, gardeners have this restless relationship with wildlife and nature, right? I mean, we have two camps. There's good nature and bad nature. The bees are good, but the deer are not. And it doesn't really work that way, right? You kind of have to, you get everybody. It's a little all or nothing. And so, you learn to live with it. I mean, you learn to make thoughtful decisions about maybe what you plant and at what abundance you plant something. And abundance is a key thing. Abundance is a key theme throughout my work. And I think especially it comes through in Your Natural Garden, where, when you're growing more than just one of something, right? When you make an investment to plant, a little population of something, or you let one or a few little things become a lot more, either through reseeding or spreading or whatever, you can give 20% back, right? Like it doesn't, when you have a population of something, if one or two get eaten and 8 don't, is that the end of the world? And so I think some of it is learning to think about just the scale of things too. Obviously, when you have that one precious specimen and it gets its central leader lopped off by a deer, it feels pretty consequential at that point. But when you start to think about, now of course not everything in the garden grows in a population or a big population, but probably a lot more should than does. And so you should think about just the levels of diversity and then the levels of abundance of any of those species. You start to realize, I mean, am I really even going to notice if 20% go missing because the deer need something to eat? But, that's not to say I don't chase them off when they surprise me in the garden. Our interactions are still a wild card, but we learn to sort of grit our teeth and bear it.
Yeah, I mean, it's tough. You're like, it's Bambi, but I still want my garden. And the more urban areas where the deer pressure and population is just exponential now, it's getting to be like, it's either nothing or there's just no understory in a lot of our parks. Yeah.
Yeah, right. And I know it's totally true. And I think the challenge is that in urban spaces where each one of us might be considering a smaller and smaller piece to work with, the likelihood due to chance alone that even one deer's browsing is going to have consequential damage is pretty high, right? Because our sample set is just so not representative of the landscape at large. We're talking about, each of us are talking about our little shards of the of the surface of the planet here. So I don't mean to denude the fact that it is a concern. But it does require then some thoughtfulness to say, okay, so inside of that relatively small footprint, what can I do to mitigate? What can I do to, maybe create places that just are likely not to be on the route that a deer undertakes to go for a browse, right? I mean, one of the things that that comes through in a lot of things that you read about deer behavior, talking mostly about white-tailed deer, but is their depth perception is not particularly great, and so they're challenged by places that they perceive to be small and places that feel unsafe, and so we see a lot of deer fencing 8 and 10 feet high, but because they can't of course jump, but that's not that's not the one size fits all solution. In fact, you can have relatively short fences so long as they create spaces that don't feel safe for a lot of deer. There's a depth perception issue there. So we've tried to frame things in the course of our own gardening here at Three Oaks. There's kind of the path that separates the hedgerow from most of the rest of the garden is largely where it is because that's the deer path. And so there's we just sort of assume that the hedgerow is always going to be subject to some of their activities. So we just don't plant anything there that's on the lower end of, or on the higher end of the likelihood that it's going to get browsed. I mean, if it gets rubbed, that's one thing that's hard to deal with. But and we actually, we've been gardening along that hedgerow now for 5 or so years, and have had beautiful Taylor cedar, never bothered before, gets scraped right down the middle about a month ago, and it was just gosh, fine for 5 years. What was so special about today? But
today was the day.
Yeah.
Well, let's turn to something a little more positive, and that is the upcoming GreenScapes program that's put on by Brookside Gardens, and you're one of the presenting speakers at that. And so I should let listeners know it's coming up February 14th, Valentine's Day 2025, and it's all virtual, all online, so anybody anywhere can register for it. You can just go to montgomeryparks.org and put in GreenScapes, all one word. And I think you're the post-lunch speaker.
Ooh, an unenviable spot.
Yeah. I'm sure people will be fascinated by your talk, though. So your title is Practicing New Naturalism.
Yeah, so the presentation is, it's a few things. We'll talk about some themes that are in the new book, Your Natural Garden, but we'll do that kind of via stories of some of these ideas in practice out there in the real world. And so we'll show a number of our projects that employ some of these ideas, some of the places that maybe we developed them as well. And so it'll be a kind of a real world scenario talk that shows various kinds of natural gardens and landscapes kind of in action.
Mm-hmm. And I should also note that even if you can't watch it live, it's all recorded. As long as you're registered, you'll get sent that afterwards. But of course, attending live is better because you'll be there to answer questions afterwards too.
Yeah, it's. I spoke at it a few years ago, again, right after New Naturalism came out, and it's such a great event. I mean, it's just so well attended. They've built a kind of beautiful thing there with a virtual program that has quite a reach, a broad geographic range of attendees, and probably certainly with an emphasis there on the Eastern Seaboard, broadly speaking. But looking forward to it. I think it's going to be a great day.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Washington Gardener Magazine is a media sponsor, and we're happy to be involved and super excited about the program, which includes Ulrich Lorimer and several other wonderful speakers. So that's going to be a great day. And so let's talk a little, Kelly, about things that gardeners love to talk about, and that's our favorite plants. So I'm gonna put you on the spot and say, you don't have to pick just one, but what plants are on your minds these days?
The one wonderful thing about my life is creatively I've built a practice and a studio around thinking about plants all day long for the most part. So the beautiful thing about the work we get called to do, in various geographies, we work all over the country increasingly. And as we get to go to places where we get to just expand our palette and look at things that we may not have otherwise reason to grow, for one reason or another. And so we're site specific and plant driven in our work. And but at a personal level, I love grasses. I'm a total grass geek. I'm a boy of the prairie. How could I not be? And so, grasses, and we do obviously a lot of meadows and, various scales, kind of residential size things all the way up to, we're working on a series of detention basins right now that are, like 1.5 acres. And so that's a pretty big canvas to work on and get to have some fun with and think about patterns. And then, so grasses, become just such a base component of our palette. I mean, they're all over the world. They're fundamental to a great number of ecosystems: sun, shade, wet, dry. There's always a grass. So we think a lot about grasses. We're always working with grasses. My early introduction to a career in horticulture came through irises, because I talked my parents when I was 15 into buying a bearded iris nursery and moving it from Texas to Iowa. So another story for another time, but I still love irises. I love that whole family, actually. The Iridaceae are a wonderful, wonderful family, broadly distributed around the world. Everything from crocuses to gladiolas to irises. Give us it's a very diverse family, and so still have a soft spot for irises, and still do a little hybridizing and breeding just as a hobby on the side. But and obviously in North America we have a lovely palette of native North American irises, generally in one or a couple sections of the genus, depending on where you're at in the country. Woodland species that like to be in wetter conditions. So irises are still a soft spot. And I suppose if I'll cut it off at 3, and I'm describing them broadly, I would say that I also think a lot about asters, particularly North American asters, Cynthia trichomes. And, we are fortunate in North America to be, for Asteraceae in the big picture, to be a center of its diversity. Obviously, Cynthia trichomes are our North American asters, things like New England aster and purple stemmed aster, and Cynthia trichum of Angliae and Cynthia trichum puniceum there. But they're so essential. I love autumn. Autumn is after a hot, humid Midwestern summer, September and October kind of gifts before winter, before we get a reminder of the other end of the extreme of the Midwestern climate. So, trying to savor those autumn days as the sunlight fades a few minutes a day is all the more enhanced by the diversity of asters that we get to enjoy in that last final flourish of the gardening season.
Yeah, I always say there's an aster for every situation.
Yeah.
They're such good doers, but they're, demure is one word we could use for them. They kind of are, a lot of them fade into the background. They're not as showy as like a big single iris might be.
Yeah.
But they're such tough plants.
Oh yeah. And again, the diversity of what's out there, thinking about the 2 I mentioned, New England aster and purple stemmed aster, plants that kind of prairie, wet meadow, even marshy kinds of plants. And then you go to the other end of the spectrum and, look at something like a heath aster, Cynthia trichum ericoides, which, you're as likely to find on a sandy, dry, bald somewhere out here in the Midwest or the Great Plains as you would even potentially on a dune somewhere. So it's just such a compendium of traits and species that occupy the range of ecologies that are out there. You're absolutely right. There's truly an aster for every spot.
Mm-hmm. And I love the use of whitewood aster as a ground cover, like in a woodland type of situation, especially if you have dry shade.
Oh yeah, great ground cover, and give it room and just let it go, and it'll form an ample carpet that'll live for decades.
So one last question for you, Kelly, and this is going to be about your heroes, your influences, anybody you want to give a shout out to.
Oh wow. I have been. That's a very meaningful question to me, Kathy, because I have been fortunate to have had and continue to have so many good mentors out there in the world. It's almost impossible to start making a list. And part of that's because I was this geeky kid that at 15 talked my parents into buying a nursery and was writing as a teenager. And so I've just I was just this like fly on the wall kind of person, and who was just sort of graciously welcomed into professional groups like Garden Com, used to be Garden Writers Association, where we met many years ago, and Perennial Plant Association, and so many others. And so horticulture and gardening is just a generous community, as I'm sure many people out there can relate to, whether you've gone to a garden club locally or found that community online today. And so gosh, I wouldn't even know where to start the list, but I will say, I will give a shout out to somebody who was so kind to put a blurb on the back of the book, and that's Lauren Springer, who is really a hero of mine. I think somebody who has been at the forefront of thinking about plants and place and regional identity for the whole of her career. And of course, a great number of books to her credit: The Undaunted Garden, Plant-Driven Design. And, Lauren has a spectacular garden in Fort Collins at the Gardens on Spring Creek, terrific public garden there in Fort Collins.
It's so beautiful.
It's unbelievable. And it's a city nonprofit partnership. Those kinds of relationships can always be fraught and challenging. And somehow, a great garden has come out of it. And it's just really lovely to see. And it's bold, and it's brave, and it's provocative, and it also tells people a story of their place that in a very beautiful way. And so Lauren's been a great champion and supporter of mine for quite a while now, and she was generous to offer a nice blurb on the back of the book. So my shout out to Lauren Springer. That's today.
That was sweet, Kelly. Wonderful. Well, thank you for being a guest on the GardenDC podcast.
Oh, thanks for having me. It's been great to chat.
GardenDC will be back after this short break.
In the book, The Urban Garden by Kathy Jentz and Teri Speight, you'll find dozens of inspiring and creative ways to grow flowers, shrubs, vegetables, herbs, and other plants in small spaces and with a limited budget. Whether you want to grow on a balcony, rooftop, front stoop, or a tiny urban patio, turn your growing dreams into reality and build a gorgeous and unique garden that showcases your personal style while still being functional and productive. With the genius ideas and resourceful tactics found here, you'll be maximizing yields and beauty from every square inch of your space. No matter what you grow, the 101 amazing growing ideas found in the urban garden will turn your tiny urban yard into a treasure trove of green you'll be proud to share with family and friends. Buy your copy today at your local retail bookseller or order it online now at Amazon.com or bookshop.org.
Sergeant and Mr. Smith, you're going to love this house.
Bunk beds in a closet?
There's no field manual for finding the right home. But when you do, USAA Homeowners Insurance can help protect it the right way. Restrictions apply.
Mangave plant profile. Mangave, Agave-Manfreda acantha, is an evergreen tender perennial succulent that comes in a variety of leaf patterns and colors, from blue to green to red and purple. They are hardy to 15 degrees Fahrenheit, so will need to be taken inside or given winter protection in areas with colder winters. They are a cross between the agave plant and a manfreda. The spines at the tips are not as sharp as the ones on agave, though. Mangave are deer and rabbit resistant. They prefer full sun and to be planted in well-drained, gritty soils. They produce flowers when they are between 2 to 7 years old. In general, Mangave are monocarpic plants, meaning that they flower once, produce seeds, and then die. They are drought tolerant once established, but regular waterings can encourage faster growth when they are young. Trim off any brown or damaged foliage near the base of the leaf. Propagate them by carefully removing and repotting the pups or offsets that are produced. Mangave, you can grow that. What's new this week in the garden? Well, we're starting to have a thaw, and I see that my heathers are blooming. Also, my witch hazel Whistly Supreme has started to bloom. Spring is just around the corner. In the garden tips that we shared on our social media this week, we included lots of seed starting advice, including to clean, sanitize, organize, and inventory your seed starting supplies to get a good start on your indoor seeds in February. If you're thinking about starting seeds indoors, you can build your own tabletop light stand for minimal cost, and we included a link to extension.umd.edu for their PVC light stand instructions. And we advise using a kitchen sieve to sprinkle soilless seed starting mix evenly over the tops of seeds that call for a thin layer of soil to germinate them. In local gardening events, if you're in the Washington, D.C. or Mid-Atlantic region, you might want to attend the Hyattsville Horticultural Society's 13th annual seed sale and garden fair. And that is on Saturday, February 8th at the Hyattsville Municipal Building in Hyattsville, Maryland, 4310 Gallatin Street from 10 a.m. to 3 p.m. You can find out more about that at Hyattsville Horticultural Society's website. Next, Merrifield Garden Center is having their Orchid Extravaganza on Saturday, February 22nd from 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. at their Gainesville, Virginia store. That will be a class with plant specialist Paul Knight and a repotting event. So check that out at merrifieldgardencenter.com. Finally, Sunday, February 23rd, start your garden seeds at W.S. Jentz, and that is in Washington, D.C., and you can sign up for that through Eventbrite, and it takes place from 1 to 2 p.m. That includes a lesson on seed starting, and if you're buying all those seed starting supplies, sounds daunting, W.S. Jentz is preparing your seed trays with garden experts. Choose from more than a dozen container-friendly varieties, and they'll provide the pots, soils, and more. Check it out at their website, W.S. Jentz, or again at eventbrite.com. Happy gardening!
This is Christy Page with Food Gardening Network on the best seed starting methods for max germination by Amanda MacArthur. When it comes to seed starting, there are a variety of different methods that you can use depending on your preferences and the types of seeds you want to start. Some popular seed starting methods include seed flats, seed tapes, seed mats, and peat pots. Now, seed flats are trays or containers filled with soil or other growing medium in which seeds are placed and then covered with a lid or plastic wrap. This method is ideal for larger quantity of seedlings and allows you to plant several seeds at once. Seed tapes are sheets of material that contain pre-measured amount of seed embedded in it. All you need to do is place the seed tape into your garden bed or pot, cover it with soil, and watch your seedlings grow. This is a great option for gardeners who want to make sure that their seedlings are evenly spaced in the soil. Seed mats are flat pieces of material that contain pre-measured amounts of seed mixed with growing medium. To use seed mats, simply lay them out in your garden bed or pot and cover them with soil. You can also cut seed mats into smaller sections for planting different types of seedlings in one area. Peat pots are small containers made from peat moss that allow you to start seedlings indoors without having to disturb the roots when transplanting them into the garden or pot later on. Just plant your seeds directly in the peat pot, water them, and watch them grow. Now, the above methods that we just talked about are what we call the traditional ones, but there are other ways to start seeds too. Rockwool, traditionally used in hydroponics, is great at holding moisture without oversaturating delicate seeds in the germination process. I put my rock wool cubes in a shallow dish or takeout container, use a heat lamp, and close the lid until they sprout. Eggshells are biodegradable and can be planted directly in the garden. Just make sure to bake the shells first to kill off any pathogens. Takeout trays for tubers. Sprout your early and main crop potatoes before planting them in the garden by engaging in a process known as chitting. You place blemish-free potatoes with their eyes facing up into egg cartons or drink takeout trays, then position those trays somewhere that is cool but frost-free and dark. Damp paper towels or toilet paper can be used. Simply place the seeds on a moist paper towel or other dampened option, seal in a plastic bag, and store in cool darkness to catalyze growth. Once they sprout, transfer into light potting soil as soon as possible. And finally, cardboard tubes also make great seed starters. Simply stand them up and fill them with damp seed starting mix. Plant your seed at the top and watch it grow. You can then transplant the seedling into your garden when you are ready. So whether you prefer traditional methods or are looking for something a little more innovative, there's no shortage of options available for seed starting. Just choose whichever method works best for you and get growing. The most important thing is to make sure your seedlings get enough sunlight, water, and nutrients so that they can grow healthy and strong. If you're ready to get started with gardening this spring, consider one of these seed starting methods for a bountiful harvest later on. Happy seed starting! This has been The Last Word by Christy Page at foodgardening.com.
Thank you for listening to Garden DC. You can become a listener supporter for as little as 99 cents a month by going to the supporter link in our show notes or directly to podcasters.spotify.com/pod/show/GardenDC/support. Another way to support this podcast is to subscribe to our monthly digital publication, Washington Gardener Magazine. To do so, go to WashingtonGardener.com or WashingtonGardener.blogspot.com. You can find Washington Gardener on social media at WDC Gardener on Twitter or X, Instagram, and Pinterest, and on Facebook at Washington Gardener Magazine. And be sure to leave us a 5-star review on your favorite podcast platform. Please take a minute to share us on social media with #GardenDC so other gardeners can find us too.